Hey, ladies and gentlemen, it's Steve here. Before we get started this week, I want to let you know that on BJJ Mental Models Premium, we just launched an awesome three-part series with four-time world champ Dominika Obelenite. It's about competition and the crushing emotional pressure that can go along with it. Critical listen for anyone who's a competitor or really anyone who works in a high-stress environment. Give it a shot, premium.bjjmentalmodels.com. You can check it out and get a free trial. Give it a listen. If you don't like it, cancel with no risk. Again, premium.bjjmentalmodels.com, and enjoy the show. Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 166. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach. And today, happy to be joined by another member of the jiu-jitsu podcast cinematic universe here. We got Mr. Nick Chewy Albin. Nick, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm great, brother. How are you?
I am not bad. I believe, like you, I am also buried under about 2 feet of snow, which is fun. But like we were saying earlier, that is the best time to record a podcast, I suppose, is when you literally can't leave your house.
Yeah, well, I'm not buried under 2 feet. See, 2 feet is a reasonable amount to be snowed in and buried under. But Kentucky is kind of in a weird place where we're north enough in the United States where we get a lot of snow. Well, not a lot, but we get some snow. But we're close enough to the south that we don't know how to deal with it. And so, we get a small amount of snow and everything in the city shuts down. So, and nobody really knows how to drive because the snows are so infrequent. We get maybe 3 decent snows on a good year. And so we don't really know how to deal with it. And so that's what's going on over in our neck of the woods.
Exciting. Lovely. Well, hey, hopefully it clears up soon. I'm looking forward to some warmer weather. But with that said, Nick, of course, I think probably most people who are jiu-jitsu podcast enthusiasts are already going to know exactly who you are. But just in case, why don't you give yourself a quick intro?
Quick intro. Well, my name is, everybody refers to me as Chewy. Like the name Nick is interesting because I don't get it very often. It's kind of like the family name, or, my fiance might call me Nick, but everybody else is just Chewy. And in fact, like when we're at events, if I'm at an event, my fiance will refer to me as Chewy because I don't respond to Nick in those settings. and yeah, most people know me from, my online stuff, like my YouTube channel and everything else like that. And I've been training jiu-jitsu for, I started wrestling in high school and then got into jiu-jitsu afterwards back in 2003 after wrestling. So I've been grappling for about 20 years now. And, actually a little over 20, and it's getting closer to 21, 22 years now. And then, so I got into jiu-jitsu, started competing, and then just kept doing it for a long period of time. And then back in 2015, 2014 is when I started being sort of posting videos on a regular basis. And now, surprisingly, a large amount of people know who I am.
It is funny. I knew of Chewy for a long time. I've known of Chewy for ages, and it took me a long time to realize that Chewy is also Nick Albin, because I'd seen that name floating around as well, and I didn't learn until shockingly late that actually it's the same person. So good to finally be able to put a voice to the face and a face to the name. And cool. Awesome. So with that said, I would love to geek out about podcast stuff, of course, but I think what's probably more applicable to the majority of people, something that our community was asking I talked to you about, which is back control. I know that's a passion of yours, probably a passion for most jiu-jitsu people, but something that I think you have been focusing on quite a bit. And so I'd love to maybe do a deep dive into how you play this position, what the concepts are that you kind of generally follow behind this position, and maybe just go through some of the variations of how this thing is normally played. Okay. So if that is amenable to you, I would love to dig into this.
Yeah, let's chat about it.
So I guess the first thing to ask before we get into this is, from your perspective, how much does back control vary depending on rule set or context, like gi or no gi? Do you feel that the position changes in any fundamental ways depending on whether you're under like ADCC rules or IBJJF, or whether the gi is involved or not? Does it get custom tailored, or do you generally find that you play it the same no matter what?
I mean, I pretty much play the same no matter what. I've competed under ADCC rules. I've competed in submission only rules. I've competed under IBJJF rules and, points based tournaments and things like that. And the way that I play the back is not going to change because, I mean, ultimately, when I get to the back, there's one reason to get there. It's to submit the person. Even if I'm in a point situation, I want to submit the person. That's what I'm there to do. I'm not there to just hang out in the back personally. And then so my back mount doesn't change the way that I play it. The only thing that changes when you add the gi into it is that you have some new weapons to throw into the mix because no longer are you sort of only worried about the choking arm and getting rear naked choked or maybe an arm lock or something like that. You're now having to be concerned with things like lapels and the gi and things like that. And so those add a different element to them. They can also begin to create some difficulties because in no-gi, it's much easier to slide the arm underneath for a rear naked choke. It's not impossible, of course, in the gi, but it's much easier to slide up under someone's neck after you've sort of hand fought and you've gotten yourself into a good position in the back. In no-gi, it's easy to slide through, but in the gi, sometimes the fabric and the friction that it creates can be an impediment to actually going for the rear naked choke. So there, a lot of times you'll start to opt for sometimes the lapels or things like that. But yeah, nothing really changes. There's just some different weapons that you might use in one versus the other.
Yeah, this is the lesson I learned when I started really studying the back mount earlier in my jiu-jitsu career. I sort of assumed that when you got to the back mount, the goal was the rear naked choke. It's just such an iconic finish from there. If you are a fan of MMA, of course, you're used to seeing it. And I think for a lot of people, they view the back mount and the rear naked choke as being very closely married. But I generally primarily play the gi. And I was kind of frustrated for a long time because, like you said, I find it challenging to slip that grip under the chin in the gi, at least compared to no-gi. I mean, in no-gi, it's like a key going into a lock, right? When you go for the choke, it just slips in perfectly and there you go. But in the gi, you've got fabric friction to deal with. It's easier for your opponent to stop your hand because they can grab the fabric. And it wasn't until embarrassingly late in my journey that I started developing a lot of the collar and lapel chokes from the back. And that's when my back mount finishing went up a lot because I wasn't just trying to force the rear naked choke. I opened my mind up to all of these other submissions and attacks that can come from there. So for me, that was a big breakthrough, at least personally.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because again, it's there. Why not use it? I mean, I personally probably as a person probably prefer no-gi more. I enjoy it more and it tends to wreck my body a little bit less than the gi. But I do both. And, if you're in the gi, there's no reason not to use the weapons. I mean, they're there. You might as well play with them. And when you start to add into lapel chokes and everything else and even grips on the gi, can be used as threats to take the attention away from someone so that you can attack the arm if you want to. So they're very useful.
Yeah, the thing I enjoy about a lot of the gi-based setups is once a person gets one hand on your collar, you're in dire danger from the back mount. In no-gi, it feels like you've got a little bit more wiggle room to fight things around. But one lesson that people always have to learn in the gi is that you can never take a collar grip lightly. It's always a threat. And especially from the back, that one collar grip can be so easily wound up into other submissions. And I think that's one of the unique things about the collar chokes, whereas with a rear naked choke, for example, you need to be behind the person, you need to hold the position, and you basically need to be using both of your hands to fight for the choke. When you're going for something like a bow and arrow choke, even if the person defending is defending relatively well, it's very hard for them to stop you from pivoting your body to, say, a 90-degree angle and setting up the bow and arrow or anything like that. So once that first grip is in play, it gets really, really hard for the person to start fighting it off. And the defenses are generally so much different than what you would see in no-gi.
Yeah, it's interesting. So this is something we've been going over in my class the last few weeks because we've been playing back mount. One of the things is there's a couple of grip breaks that you can do from the back mount in the defensive position. So if someone has your back and they get that collar grip where they're kind of under your neck and they've got that lapel, and it can be, again, it can be a precarious thing because one small wrong movement and it's going to be it. And there's a couple of grip breaks from there that people should know. I mean, they're very useful that a lot of people don't seem to use. And these grip breaks have saved me. Like there's been numerous times where I've been caught literally in a bow and arrow choke where it's sunk in and I'm starting to, I have this one last effort and I'm able to break the grip. Doesn't mean it always works, but it's there, opposed to trying to fight the arm or the forearm or something like that to create space for the neck. And then it's another thing we've been talking about is a lot of people, when they shoot for their rear naked chokes, they don't really get the proper depth of the choke, and it makes it very easy to defend. A lot of people, and I see this when I watch grappling, and I see this from my students when they come in, and even when I roll with people, a lot of times they'll shoot their arm underneath, and a lot of times they don't get that elbow. There are, let me sort of say this, there are exceptions to this because sometimes people have very large, thick necks, but that's more of an exception. It's not the rule. A lot of times people do not shoot their rear naked chokes through deep enough where you can hide your wrist. Because if you get your rear naked choke grip deep enough to where you can literally take your hand and you can cup either their shoulder, or sometimes if you're really long, you can cup your own shoulder. If you can get it back there, it's going to be incredibly difficult for that person to grab your wrist, which the wrist in your hand is going to be the best place for them to be able to defend. They can grab your forearm all they want to, but if you have your elbow right up under their chin and you're able to squeeze good pressure across their carotids, you can finish a one-arm choke pretty easily with just being able to secure another grip. And this is something that we've been going over because a lot of people, when they shoot the rear naked choke, they'll shoot it under and they'll shoot it shallow, and the person can get a decent grip on their wrist or their hand or whatever to where it stops it. Whereas if you shoot deep enough, you can get it in. Not to say that it's going to be 100% because nothing's 100%, but I found that it's a lot of times if you get it through there, it's a very, there's a low likelihood that they'll be able to fight that out of there because you get the proper depth. But if you look at the body, it's going to look different. You're almost going to be turning your chest up to the ceiling to get this proper depth. Like I did a competition, the 80cc trials in 2018. And I remember I went against a guy and there was a transition where as I was taking the person's, I passed his guard and I was taking his back, and he was a typical type person that would Granby roll and do the turtle and roll through and everything else. And so I took his back and I try to practice catching rear naked chokes while we're still transitioning before I've actually secured the back mount, because a lot of times once you secure the back mount, you go into it turns into a hand fighting battle. Yeah. Whereas if you catch the choke on the fly, and in most of my competitions, believe it or not, I've got the choke before I actually have the hooks in. We can talk more about that later, but I caught the choke on him, and as we're moving, I had a one-arm choke locked in, and the squeeze was not necessarily just coming from my arms. It was coming from the whole body, and a big part of that was my lat. So my right arm was underneath of his neck, and my right lat was sort of stretched out, wrapping around. And I remember when I got the choke, and it was a one-arm choke. I ended up finishing it with the one arm and then switched to the regular two-hand rear naked choke. And my lat was so stressed from that I ended up getting a pulled muscle from it.
Oh, boy.
And so again, but if you think about that, most people don't engage certain muscles with their submissions, right? Like they're not using their upper back and their lats and their hips and their knees and everything into that submission. They focus on just the squeeze of the arms. And so if you get that depth and you also learn how to engage like your whole body into the submission, it becomes a really powerful thing. And obviously you can do this with the bow and arrow and stuff, but a bow and arrow, a lot of times people, they just inherently understand, okay, we're going to engage the whole body by squeezing the knees, pulling the lats back, and we're using the whole body. But a lot of times with the rear naked choke, people don't necessarily do that. They think of just squeezing with their arms, and they leave a lot of extra added pressure that could really cinch it in on the table.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. Something that we've talked about on our show quite a bit is this idea of overwhelming force, especially when you're trying to use lever control on your opponent, or you're trying to finish a submission. It's so common that people, especially for chokes, they try to wrench with their hands only. But really, out of all of the weapons that you have in your body, your arms are actually among the weakest, right? You should be engaging your core, even your legs, if you possibly can. And I have certainly caught myself making this mistake where I'm trying to reef on a choke on somebody, and I realize at some point, I think I'm just using my hands here. And my hands are, I'm not a bodybuilder by any stretch. I do not have great upper body strength. So especially if you're fighting up a weight class, often your hands won't be enough. But when you're able to start engaging your core, for example, like you said, using your lats, using your chest, depending on the way you're playing the back mount, even the legs sometimes, that's where the power comes from in the choke.
There's a lot of power to be used from the hips and the legs. This is another thing, this is, I think, sometimes the difference between what we would quote, say, a quote, advanced technique. a lot of times people look at simple techniques that they learned early on, and they have a tendency, which I think this is wrongly so, to sort of look over them and be like, that's old stuff. That's fundamental stuff. Like I need the new stuff. Right.
Yeah.
But then you see people in very high levels of jiu-jitsu. Most famously, we have Hadrick Gracie, which if someone's newer to jiu-jitsu, Hadrick Gracie did something amazing back in the day where he submitted all of his opponents with the same X choke, just over and over again. And we're talking about like good guys. We're not talking about like random like black belts at some gym. I mean, we're talking to the best of the best, and submitted him with the same move that he probably learned as a white belt. But there's a difference. Like for instance, my rear naked choke now is so much different than what it was when I was a white belt, both the way that I actually finish it and the way that I put my body around it and the way that I engage my body in that whole thing. I mean, from my head to my toe, if I have a rear naked choke wrapped around you and I'm really trying to choke you, my whole body's engaged. And I think this should be always a thing that every jiu-jitsu practitioner should be trying to do. Anytime you do a submission, you should really take, like, especially when you're practicing techniques that you've already learned and you can already do pretty easily. This is going to happen after a certain point. You're starting to, your class will go through the same stuff again at some point. When you go back through that stuff, it would be wise not to simply gloss over and go, oh, I've already done this before. You can start to really fine tune the details in those positions. And for instance, when you're doing a submission that you already know, you should be trying to figure out how to engage more muscles, more of your body into that thing. Another example with submissions is a lot of times early on, people, when they do like an arm bar, let's say they're in mount or side control and they get to an arm bar, they have the legs over the person's face and their chest. They will then a lot of times try to use more arm and upper body strength to try to pull to finish. When in reality, you should be attaching that arm to your body. And then it becomes essentially like you're almost doing like a deadlift where you're extending your hips forward and extending your back and everything's going at the same time. The arms do a lot less of that movement and that strength that's used, opposed to like you trying to bicep curl. And like you said, overwhelming force. Doing an armbar in that manner would allow you to be successful against a very strong opponent who's much larger than you, opposed to if you try to out bicep curl someone that's much stronger than you, that's going to be a losing situation.
Yeah, I used to think of arm bars as a move that, you just can't do that against bigger guys. Mm-hmm. But that's because I was making this mistake that you described where I looked at the arm bar like an exercise of my arms. Mm-hmm. And I thought, like many white belts continue to think that the way you get the arm bar is you grab the person's arm and you pull it. But in reality, like you said, your arms are basically just there as a rudder or a fastener. You're basically just grabbing the person's arm and stapling it to your own body. The power of the arm bar comes from your hips and your legs. The arms are really just there to hold the dude's arm in place so it doesn't go flying all over the place or so he can't hitchhike or pull it out somehow. Really, the mechanics of an armbar involve using your hips and your legs. That's where the power comes from. And I've noticed this pattern with a lot of submissions, and I think this is kind of just a natural part of everyone's jiu-jitsu journey. When you and I walk around in day-to-day life, when we're, buying the groceries or we're signing checks or doing whatever you're doing on a day-to-day basis, we tend to be, as humans, very deliberate with what we're doing with our hands, but we're often not really thinking about what we're doing with our legs or our core or our head even. I mean, those parts of the body are just kind of on autopilot. We pay attention to the things that our hands are doing. And I see that when you're sparring with white belts or blue belts, people at that level, they are overly preoccupied with what their hands are doing. They're trying to focus on, okay, hand goes here, hand goes there, but they're usually not putting sufficient thought into what are my legs doing now? What is my core doing now? And by the time someone starts getting more advanced to purple or brown or black belt, we also need them to be thinking about what their head is doing, because head positioning is also such a key part of, in the case of back control, you can make or break it depending on where you put your head, right? That is such an important part of the conversation. So I see that as kind of part of the learning journey. And one of the things I like to see out of people as they get to that blue belt level and beyond is I want to see them starting to use their arms, legs, core, and head in concert, kind of like a big fighting octopus where you're using all of your limbs in one go. And with the back mount, especially with a lot of the finishes, that's the breakthrough for people, is realizing, okay, I'm not just reefing on this dude's neck with my arms. I am using my whole body to kind of like coil pressure around his carotid arteries. It's much more about your core and your legs than it actually is about just squeezing with your hands.
Yeah, and the thing is when people come into the gym in the beginning, it's not something that they can help, so there's no shortcut to it. You can't think your way out of this. This is a thing with us in a lot of times in societies. We think we can just outthink something, and we can learn something in our head and therefore we'll be able to do it. But the reality is that your body has to become accustomed to everything, and it has to be able to execute a number of different patterns automatically without thinking. Because there's not going to be enough room for sufficient thought for that. So you think about like grip fighting. So one of the things that I can do literally automatically, I don't think about it, is I can grip fight. I can constantly fight grips and I don't think about them because my body's been doing this stuff for so long. When you think about jiu-jitsu, a lot of what we do is pattern recognition, whether we know it or not, because we're constantly, this is why a coach will say, hey, like we're going to go for this technique. And then if he goes for this, we're going to do this, because there are these normalized patterns that happen. This is also the same reason why if you roll with someone from another grappling art, say sambo or wrestling or, judo, they can really throw you for a loop because they are engaging in a different pattern than what's normal in jiu-jitsu. But going back to it, when you're training, you begin to sort of learn these patterns intuitively. It becomes like you are learning, obviously, in the conscious head level and being able to articulate some of it better and better as time goes on. But it has to be learned in the body. And this is why, learning a technique and being able to regurgitate it really, in my book, doesn't mean a whole lot. It comes down to, can you actually use this thing? Because this in essence is what jiu-jitsu is all about. It's about, I need to be able to use this technique against someone. This is why when you look at judo and how it's split in the emphasis on like things like, actual live training, that's why they took out the more lethal techniques, right? So they could then train this stuff live and you could do your newaza or your rando or whatever. And with jiu-jitsu, it's why we focus on so much grappling, because we can grapple, we can go, and we can get used to someone trying to grab our head. We can get used to someone trying to grab our neck or whatever, and become very comfortable with that situation. And so over time, we become very accustomed to what's going on, and your body begins to recognize these patterns very intuitively. And it's at that point that then you begin to unlock another level of ability. You start to, I've got the main things going down, right? I've got the gross motor patterns down. Now I can start fine-tuning things a little bit more. It's very similar to lifting weights. If someone's ever lifted weights for a long period of time, you could look at a bench press, for instance, and it looks very simple and it looks like there's not a whole lot to it. You just put the weight on your chest and you move it. But the more and more you do that exercise, and if you get someone that really knows what they're doing with lifting, you'll start to figure out ways where you can like fine tune the way your body is positioned to make sure that your shoulder stays in place, to make sure you hit the chest a little bit better, or you can even adjust the grip a little bit more to make sure you hit more triceps or whatever. And you can begin to get more in tune with your body and feel certain muscle groups. And likewise, as you get the basic patterns down of a technique, you then are allowed, your body then can start to focus on the finer details, because all the basic stuff that needs to make that thing happen, that becomes automatic. And then that's when you get that next level of ability. And you can even call it thinking in jiu-jitsu. But for anybody that's new, I always say this, because you're not going to think your way out of it. It has to come from over time, your body. It's a sort of intelligence of your body, not necessarily in your noggin, because your noggin's not you're not going to outthink someone and get better than them. You're going to train and you're going to get intuitively better through your body. And then over time, once that basic stuff's in place, that's when you actually get the ability to maybe, we'll say, think a little bit more about what you're doing on the mat.
Yeah, this harkens back to some conversations we've had in the past. There's a really incredible landmark book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow.
Yeah.
Yeah, he discusses exactly what you're talking about, how there's kind of two systems for decision making in your brain. One is the slow deliberative part where you need to think about things, and that's an incredibly powerful part of our brain, right? That's part of what makes us human, is we can sit and we can deliberate and we can think and we can rationalize. But the problem is that part of your brain is not fast enough to respond to some dude trying to choke you and backflip over you and pass your guard. But then there's this other part of your brain, which is internalized motion, your muscle memory, for lack of a better term, the things that you're so comfortable with that you can do them without even thinking about them. And back mount is a very good example of this, actually, because at least when I was a beginner, I had a hell of a time holding back mount on people because there were so many variables to control. I mean, I couldn't even really think about, okay, how am I going to choke this guy? Because I was so busy trying to focus on, okay, do I have the right grips here? Do I have a seatbelt? Do I need a seatbelt? Oh, okay, do I go to the strong side or the weak side? Which one of those is good again and why? And what about my feet? Where do they go? There's just so many variables to control that you can't even really think about building a strategy or a game plan on top of that stuff until you've internalized that knowledge into your body. And then once you've been drilling and playing this position for so long that you don't even need to think about it, and it's just like driving a car, then you can start layering the fancy strategies on top of it because you've internalized that base knowledge. And so now that frees up your brain to operate at a higher level. So that's kind of one of the fun things about peak performance is getting that knowledge into your body so you don't even need to use your brain cycles to do it. It just kind of happens on its own.
Right. And it's at that moment where all of a sudden when you get to that level where everything's pushed into automaticity, it's at that point where then you start having these glimpses of these thoughts and these ideas that pop up as you're rolling, and you can literally think about what's going on because everything that you're doing is so automatic. And you'll end up finding, and for people that are listening, if you train long enough, you'll end up having these moments where, like, I can think about in competitions and rolling and everything else where I literally will recognize the opportunity and I will already be finishing the technique before I even have really thought about what I'm doing. I remember a number of different times where I'm literally taking a person's back and we're in this rolling thing going on. So our bodies are rolling across the mat. And I sort of just intuitively noticed that the neck's open and I go for the choke. And by the time they're already tapping, I'm thinking rear naked choke. You know, the body took over again. It's you recognize, you could see it, but it's like a flash, and it's a neat thing.
Yeah, and this creates the funny situation too, where sometimes you're deliberately thinking about things and sometimes you're not thinking about things and you don't even realize what's happening, or you can't even explain what your body's doing because it's so internalized. I've been the uke before for my instructor, and he's trying to demonstrate a choke to the class, and I'm not supposed to be resisting because he's supposed to be demonstrating the choke. But I keep blocking the choke without even thinking about it. Yeah. I'm supposed to be sitting there being the good demo uke so that he can show everyone how the choke does, but the hands just come up and block the choke on their own. And I have to stop and deliberately stop myself and allow him to choke me because I'm so used to defending when people bring their hands in. So it's kind of funny that eventually when your brain goes on autopilot, sometimes you don't even realize what's happening and you have to actually stop and deliberately think if you want to do something different from your programming.
Yeah, it's funny. Anytime I've competed and I was drilling a lot leading up to that competition, I tended to do jiu-jitsu in my sleep. It's like my body's still playing around with those movements. I remember there was one night I was in the middle of doing a bunch of back-taking drills. And with the back-taking, we were doing a lot of hand fighting. And so, because again, when you take the back, one of the things that you have to learn how to do properly is hand fight, because you have to break these people, their defense down. And my girlfriend, well, she's my fiance, was girlfriend at the time. We were laying in bed together and we were spooning one another. So I was behind her and she was in front of me and we'd fallen asleep or whatever. Well, she woke up in the middle of the night and I was curling her wrist and I was like shoving my arm under her neck, like moving it around. Now, obviously I'm not doing it like in a very nice motion. It's like, imagine someone twitching in their sleep. My arm's twitching, getting wrist control on her. And then my hand keeps going under her neck and then comes back and comes under her neck. Now, luckily she had trained a little bit and she was able to, move the arm and get her head out of position and was able to kind of kick me over to the other side of the bed. But, I was doing jiu-jitsu in my sleep because, again, it's pushed so deep into the muscle memory that, as my body's decompressing and sort of going through all the stuff that it did that day, I'm still twitching and doing those same movement patterns over and over again.
Well, I think that's also part of the reason why back mount is such a powerful position, particularly at the highest levels. It takes a lot of muscle memory to play back mount effectively because of the consequences of failure, right? I mean, if you're playing back mount and you screw up, there's a very good chance that now you're on the bottom, and that sucks. That's kind of fundamentally different from things like side control and mount, where yes, you can wind up on the bottom, but a lot of the times if you're playing mount or side control, the common thing the person might do is regard, and that sucks too, but at least you're still on the top. Back control requires a lot of finesse because the consequences to screwing it up usually wind up now with you being on the bottom. And especially if you're the smaller guy, you don't want to have lost all of that traction in that runway to build up to that superior position. So to play back mount effectively, I think part of the challenge, especially for beginners, is learning how to move their arms, legs, hands in concert, learning where their head goes, and just making that happen without even having to think about it. Because if you have to think about it and you make a slip with your foot and suddenly your leg's not in the right position, very easy for your opponent to get out of it. So I kind of wish as a beginner I had spent more time drilling how to maintain and hold back control and less time trying to submit from there. Because really, I think the priority for most people should be hold the position at all costs. And only from then do you start worrying about how to actually tap the person. I'd be curious to know if you agree with that or if you feel differently.
Well, sure. I mean, that's the thing that they should do, but all of us want to win, and so all of us want to win when we're rolling. It feels good to have that finality to it. Like, I won today. I got a submission on someone. One of the drills that we do a lot in my gym is when we're working on a particular position, we do a lot of control and escape rounds, or we do this in different ways with passing and sweeping. But for instance, with back mount, we'll start in back mount and the person in the back can control, but they can't submit to the control. And then the other person has to escape. And your job is to try to hold them there for up to 2 minutes, usually is what we do it for, and see what you can do. Because again, without the threat of submission, can you hold this person in place? And if you can, it means you've got pretty darn good control. We also do this from situations where passing and sweeping. So for instance, let's say if we're working on guard passing that week, we will practice guard passing and the bottom person cannot sweep or submit. They can only defend and off balance. Now, the thing is if a person from their guard can defend a guard pass and with only the ability to off balance and put their legs in good position, they don't have the ability to threaten a sweep, and the person on top knows this, you've got a pretty good darn guard that you can defend. And then we'll do this sometimes likewise where the person from the bottom is going to try to sweep and the top person simply tries to defend. And this, again, is giving you better control from the position. This also allows the other person to play around a bit, from the person who's trying to escape. They get to escape without being submitted left and right. It gives them a better escape while the other person gets to work their control. Likewise, if the person's working on their guard passing, it allows the person on the bottom to work on their control from the guard, because the longer that they can maintain control from the guard, the more opportunities for submissions and sweeps they're going to have. And likewise, the person on top gets to practice their guard against a live opponent without having the threat of the sweep or submission be there. So it allows them to be a little bit more relaxed and play the position a little bit. But those are some of the drills that we'll do because it is important. It is important that you have to have time to control. I mean, that's the old adage, the old motto of jiu-jitsu, position before submission. But again, this is one of the reasons why you were talking about losing position. I will say that back probably does have a greater proclivity to have you end up on the bottom for sure. But if you're good at the back and you understand when you've lost it, it's not 100% for sure. It's not too high. What happens a lot of times from what I see is that people get so excited that they've got to the back, and that when a person begins to get their shoulders down flat on the mat and they essentially have lost the back at that point, they don't make adjustments and come right up to mount or come up to side control. They're still thinking, I'm trying to hold the back. And that allows the person who just escaped to turn their hips over. And so part of being good at the back mount, also is to understand when you have it and when you don't have it. And you got to be able to recognize that so that this way you can maintain your dominant position afterwards.
Yeah, the thing I always tell people is the single most important variable for holding the back is your chest glued to the back of their shoulder blades.
100%.
Your seatbelt is great, your hooks are great, but honestly, if you don't have your chest glued to the back of the shoulder blades, all other things considered, you don't have anything. You don't have a back mount because the person is already on their way out. And at that point, you need to start thinking about switching up to plan B. And I agree with you completely. A mistake a lot of people make is they will be trying to hold on with their seatbelt or their hooks for dear life, but the other person's already freed their shoulder blades. They have the shoulders on the mat. They're already partway out. At that point, the smart thing for you to do is to see, okay, is there any way I can at least either A, abandon this and get up on top to side control or mount, Or B, sometimes you can disengage the hooks and follow the person and ride them and keep your chest glued to their back. This is the thing I've started doing a lot, where if I've got the back on someone and they're actively trying to get out of it, sometimes I might feel like, okay, the only way I'm going to be able to keep my chest to back connection here is to actually release my hooks and then use my base to reposition my body so that I can follow them and ride them and keep that chest to back connection. Because I can always get my hooks back later, but if I lose that chest to back connection, I've basically lost the whole thing.
Yeah, because if you think about the back, you have hooks, you have body triangles. I play half back a lot. You have different variations of the legs. The seatbelt, you have double unders for control, and people play this. I play this a lot, double overs in certain positions with 2 choking arms going. Yeah. But the main thing, that the constant between all of those, is the chest to back connection. And another thing to understand too, and this is something that I've found, is that a lot of people mistakenly do not respect the threat that you, like, let's say if you have your chest connected to their back and their shoulder blades, many people do not respect the threat that you have available to attack them with. Yeah. They don't worry about it until you have their hooks and the seatbelt and everything else, which is a mistake, because this is where, like when I was talking about catching rear naked chokes early, what I find is that a lot of times when I'm competing, or even when I'm rolling against people that I haven't rolled with before, a lot of times they will be very cognizant of the hooks and everything else that's going on when I have my chest to their back. But a lot of times their neck isn't in the tucked in position that it would be if I had the seatbelt grip, the 2 hooks, and what we consider to be back mount. And that's a mistake, because a lot of times it's in those positions that I get early rear naked chokes, because they weren't defending properly. I might have 1 hook in, but as soon as I get my arm underneath your neck and I have a nice rear naked choke, you're going to have to come up to defend, which allows me to get the second hook in, and everything else is set. And so you have to be aware that that's really what you're after. Back mount is chest to back connection first. Everything else, you can change it, you can adjust it, but as long as you have that, you have the ability to choke the person, and you have the ability to adjust your hands and have a back mount of some sort.
Yeah, this is a really key, I'd say, black belt detail, and something that people eventually need to understand, ideally sooner rather than later, which is that it's not just a matter of getting to the back and then getting the submission. These things chain together in interesting ways. And I've seen this happen both with gi chokes, but you can also do it with the rear naked choke, where people are setting up the choke well before they get to the back mount. And so at the time they actually secure the back mount, it's already over. This is especially dangerous, I find, in the gi because of the threat of things like bow and arrow chokes. Sure. I mean, you can be in someone's guard and on the way, like in the process of passing their guard. I've seen people who have done this all the time where, they might be in half guard on top and they start setting up the bow and arrow choke grip or a collar choke grip, and they are able to hold that and transition all the way through the pass to the back. And by the time they actually get to the back, it's over at that point, right? Because they already had the choke set up. That's a big mistake that a lot of beginning people make, is they think there's a sequence that has to be followed, which would be step 1, get to the back, step 2, do the choke. But in reality, it doesn't work that way. These 2 things can be happening in parallel at the same time. And yes, a lot of people make this mistake where they won't bother tucking their chin in and defending the choke until they recognize that they're already in back mount. But at that point, it can be too late. I mean, you can finish a person with a variant of a rear naked choke from side control sometimes, right? So you've always got to be denying people access to your neck in that manner.
Yeah, and the idea of like following sequences to a T, this is something that's going to be very natural in the beginning, because in the beginning you sometimes have to follow the sequences because you don't know what you're doing. But then there becomes this beautiful thing of improvisation. It's very much like, I'm a fan of jazz, and there's a famous jazz quote, I believe it's from Charlie Parker, and he says that you master the music, you master the instrument, and then you forget all that shit and you just play music. Yeah. And so it's very similar in the sense where in jiu-jitsu, a lot of what we do, we master these, we attempt to. We sort of develop these patterns and these sequences and everything else. And then there comes a time where then you just start improvising. And this is why I also always will never like say that this is the way to do something. I'll never say like this is the only way or whatever. Like I've seen coaches sometimes where they'll they'll basically draw a line in the sand and say, this is the only correct way to do that. And I don't agree with that, because a lot of times, anytime I've ever thought that about something, it's always been proven wrong. Like someone's come along and showed, well, if you make this one small adjustment, it's perfectly fine, or it works great. And you start to just improvise. You just start to make things work. And another sort of like thing from jazz is like there was a famous story. I can't remember the two musicians that were playing. But the two musicians are playing, and one is more of the older veteran who has been around for a long time. The other one's a young guy who's playing the piano, right? And the young guy playing the piano, he said he plays the wrong note. And then the older guy, I believe it was Miles Davis. Miles Davis immediately just starts playing the wrong note in the right way, right? So he adjusts the way that he plays and plays it the right way. And a lot of times that's what you're doing, because you're going to go into things like, let's say if you have a competition or even a role with someone, you have this idea of what you're going to try to do. And maybe you get to your favorite position and you're getting ready to sink in your favorite submission from that spot, but then they do something you weren't intending. They defend in a way that you haven't seen before. And you have to learn how to play that situation the right way. And that's what we have to do. And so a lot of times that's where the improvisation comes, because while we do these patterns, we do these sequences, and they could work completely like right out of the box as is, a lot of times down the road, they're not going to. And then it becomes this thing where you have to mish and mash things together to make it work. And for lack of a better term, you've got to learn how to play those situations the right way.
Yeah, that's one of the fun things about the journey to mastery, is getting past that phase where you're just following the instructions, which you kind of need out of the gate, because there needs to be a foundation for everything you do. But there is that beautiful point in the learning journey where you go beyond just following the instructions rotely and starting to improvise and customize, and in an ideal world, even innovate and add your own contributions back to the sport, right? Very similar to what happens in the journey of getting a PhD, where you start off and at the beginning you're doing coursework, but by the end, your goal is to create some new knowledge and discover some new knowledge that is completely novel to the human experience, that has never been known before. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the fun things about getting to the point where you're a black belt or you're otherwise experienced, is you can start to kind of deviate from and violate the rules in selective strategic ways and start to get really creative. There's a whole bunch of stuff I do now, especially regarding back mount, that I would have been murdered for if I did back in the white belt days. But now, because I know what the control points are for my opponent and I know what they need to do, I can bait them, I can deny them things, I can even, sometimes make it look like they can take my back and try to trick them into hopping my back so they fall off, which is always a fun thing to do with white belts, is to like turtle up and make them think that they're going to get your back, and then they face plant, which is another reason why the chest to back connection is so critical, right? There is nothing more tragic than some white belt seeing someone turtle and thinking, I've got this, and they hop onto the person's back, but they don't have that chest to back connection, and they just slide off onto the other side. Yeah. I've seen a lot of people get hurt because they try to hop the back with no control, and then they just face plant on the other end. So yeah, it's a great example of understanding how that chest to back stuff is important, actually, is the fact that, look, if you can't glue your chest to their back, you don't actually have any control from the back at all.
Yeah, and the rules are helpful because rules give us some basic structure. But like you said, we will eventually tend to violate those rules and test things out. One area that, like with some people, this obviously some people do it, some people don't. But I've seen some coaches say that this is not the correct way to play the back mount. I will play, in a lot of cases, a double overhand position where I will have two choking arms. So your underhand, the one that goes underneath the arm in the seatbelt configuration, that's typically your secondary hand that helps grip, fight, and control. Your top arm, that's the submission one. That's the one that goes for the choke. I like playing two choking arms over top. Now, you do sacrifice some control, but if you know how to set it up, and when I do this, I change the way my legs are configured, and I also change the way that I'm sitting in position. I'm not just laying there. There's a few things you can do to maintain everything. When you do this, you then have this ability to attack on both sides. And it's a really bad threat, because now the person, like for instance, if you're playing a seatbelt, and here's another thing about back mount, if you really want a good back mount, you need to learn how to choke with both arms, because a lot of people can only choke with their dominant hand. Most people have a terrible choke from their left side. You watch at your gym, like tell someone to like choke with their left hand if they're right-handed or whatever, and they'll literally struggle to put it through. Now they could have a beautiful right arm or dominant hand rear naked choke, but then their left side or their weak side looks ridiculously difficult. And this is a problem, because then you become very predictable at that point. It's like, okay, if you take my back, all I need to worry about is your dominant hand that's over top of my shoulder. And as long as I stay tight on that and just stay clear of your grip fighting, you're not going to submit me. Whereas when you can submit an attack with both on both sides of the back, when you can play the underarm side on the bottom, the top arm side on the bottom, when you can choke with your left arm, your right arm, which then allows you to set up other arm locks and everything else, you become incredibly unpredictable. And it's very hard for the opponent or your training partner to know where you're going. And so going back to that though, playing those two choking arms, while it's I've been told before that it's the incorrect way to play the back, in many cases, once I've secured the back, if I get into a really deep battle of grip fighting, it's a way to go past all of that and I can start to choke them. Because again, I can start to break down the grips and trap the arms to my legs and everything else. And that can work sometimes. But I have a lot of success, and I have for years, where I will put myself into this weird, funky back mount. And then I start playing double choking arms. And then it happens much smoother that way for me.
Yeah, well, if that's the wrong way to do it, then you and I are in the same boat, because I also enjoy doing the same thing, attacking with two choking arms at once. And the reason I like that, I also do this from turtle as well. When I'm the person attacking from turtle, I usually, when I am attacking someone who's in turtle, I like to attack from the front. And I normally don't go for a seat belt or a body lock from there. I normally go for two choking arms against their neck. And same thing for when I'm attacking someone from the back. I like the seatbelt, of course. I even play double underhook sometimes, but I also like two choking arms. And the reason why is because a lot of people, if you have a seatbelt on them or if you have double underhooks from the back, they don't feel particularly threatened. Their defense might be good enough that they can sit there and wait, and they know you're probably going to try to choke them. And so their game plan becomes, as soon as this person brings their hand in to choke, I'm going to grab their hand or I'm going to grab their elbow and I'm going to pull it across their body, and now I'm out, right? So they'll wait for you to attack. And if you're only doing a singular attack, it's very predictable. Whereas the thing I like about having two choking arms coming in at the same time is they are in constant defensive mode. Mm-hmm. And that means that their responses become very predictable to me. I know if I'm putting both of my hands near their neck, they have to have their hands up to hand fight me and defend. They have zero choice in the matter. Same with if you're attacking a headlock from turtle, right? If you're trying to headlock the person, they have to bring their hands up to attack, because the alternative is you just choke them unconscious. Yeah. So the nice thing about doing this from the back is if you're attacking with both hands, it's a constant threat, and it immediately means both of their hands are occupied with defending. And because now their responses become much more predictable, I know it's going to be a lot harder for them to escape because they're so focused on defending the choke. If there's just constant, never-ending attacks on their neck, they hopefully won't have much time or capacity to focus on trying to get their shoulders to the mat or to otherwise escape the back mount. So by keeping it tight and constantly attacking, you can also force them into a defensive loop where they can ideally never get out from there.
Agreed.
Yeah, awesome. So on that note, something else I'd love to dig into with you here while we're talking about this dilemma of people waiting for you to attack. This is a pattern I see a lot in dominant positions. It happens in mount a lot too. You know, you were talking earlier about Hodger and his famous cross choke. The problem a lot of people have when going for the cross choke is their opponent will wait. And ideally, if you're not great at the cross choke, they'll look for a moment where you're off balanced and then they'll try to bump. And you see the same thing with the back, right? A lot of the times people feel very comfortable holding back mount, but as soon as they go for a choke, the other person grabs their arm and they use that to make space to escape. Mm-hmm. I'd be curious to know, when you do go for that choke, when you start to bring your hands up to attack, do you have any pointers to keep your hands safe and to prevent your opponent from basically doing like a backwards arm drag on you and spinning around into your guard?
Yeah, it's hard to explain through a podcast, but I think I have a couple of videos on my YouTube channel. If not, I might have an instructional on it on my website. When I play back mount and I'm going for the choke, one of the things that I do is I actually, if you were to meet me, especially like right now, I've been working a bunch of back mount for the last 3 weeks. I have mat burn all over my elbows. And the reason why I have mat burn on my elbows is because when I play back mount, I retract my choking arm back and I'll actually get up on my elbow and I'll be leaning up and basically sitting up over top of the person. Yep. Now, this helps me push the person's chest forward and it makes it harder for them to get their back. But more importantly, what it does is it positions my hand. I'll make my hand into so basically if you straighten your hand out, and make it into is like a straight blade. I will then have that arm positioned right around their shoulder so that they can't actually have a grip on it. And then from there, when I bring that arm in, I will shoot it through and go for the choke, and I'll try to go right up under their jawline. And then if for some reason, if they grab a hold of the arm, I will extend my hips and I will retract the arm back and go back to that same sort of weird sitting up position. And I'll do this over and over again. And what this does is this doesn't ever allow them to get a strong grip on that arm so that they can do that overarm defense. And so by doing this, it's basically just constant punching in, sawing motion. And it usually only takes 1 or 2 attempts. And I've usually got the choke at that point. But that's what I do. Like to get, if they've got a grip on my arm, I use my hips and pull the arm back and get my hand positioned right above their shoulder. And I don't touch the shoulder. This is a key, because if you touch the shoulder, they know where the arm's at. I pull the arm all the way back and it's just barely off, but it's still where it needs to be, but it's not touching any part of their body. So they don't actually know where it is. As soon as I touch the shoulder, they can feel where the arm is and they're going to know when I'm going in for the choke. Whereas if I pull it out just a little bit, they don't feel it. And then when I dive back in, they don't necessarily have the intuitive sense of when I'm actually going for the choke. And it makes a big difference. And that's part of like the weird back position I play. That's how I play it. I pull that arm out of there and it works great. So that's what I do. That's what I do to deal with the person getting a snag on your choking arm.
I think I know what you're talking about here. You're talking about where, and I mean, for traditional purposes, I'll use the terms strong side and weak side, even though those are debatable, right? But are you talking about where you're basically lying down on your strong side, but instead of letting the guy rest his head on your bicep, you're basically getting up on your elbow. And so you're kind of like up to your side. Is that what you're talking about?
Correct.
Yeah, I remember learning that actually at a Cobrinha seminar. I remember he showed that, and that's where I learned that. That's a great strategy because it hides your elbow. And it also, like you said, it makes it harder for them to see where your wrist is at. Normally, in the traditional way that people do this, you're basically letting the person lie down on your bicep, kind of like a pillow. Mm-hmm. And that works. But the challenge is, because your arm is extended around the front of them now, they can get at your wrist, and perhaps more problematically, they can get at your elbow and they can start prying that loose. Whereas if you're up and you're actually basing on your elbow, so you're kind of up on your side, they obviously can't get your elbow because you're basing on the floor with it, and your hand is retracted back enough that it's kind of out of the go range that they could use to attack. So yeah, that's definitely something I've seen before. But yeah, it takes some getting used to, because you're kind of, like you said, you're going to get some mat burn on your elbows, but it absolutely works. And it kind of has the benefit too of, because you're basing up a little bit higher, you're on your side a little, and that makes it easier to adjust if your opponent does something crazy.
Yeah, it's been a position. I figured it out. I never so there's some things like that where like you learned it at Cobrinha seminar, and that makes me excited because I figure stuff out sometimes. And, you know, sometimes I learn them in seminars and instructionals, but sometimes I figure things out on my own. But then I'll see like, there's a butterfly guard sweep that I do. And I remember thinking like, man, I figured out this butterfly guard sweep, and like, I figured it out on my own. No one's ever probably seen this before, whatever. I was a purple belt at the time. So, you know, so don't cut me a little slack. And then I was watching a Marcelo Garcia, an instructional like 2 years later that was filmed like a decade ago or whatever it was. And he was doing the same sweep. I'm like, oh, okay. So, you know, you find that a lot of times the same people, because we're all problem solving, and a lot of times the problems that, or the solutions we find are very similar or the same. But I started doing that particular movement because I was going with, there was a guy one day in the class. This is when I was a purple belt, and he was a really, really big guy, 260. And he wasn't the nicest person as far as rolling with the small people. And I was in a class, and the black belt at the time, a guy named Tommy, was teaching a class, and he's about 150 pounds. He comes up to me, says, Chewy, will you? And again, at this time, I'm only about the same as I am now, about 205 pounds. He comes up to me and says, Chewy, will you do something with him? Like, cause he's just being mean. And I look over, and he's got like this 140 pound guy, and he's like cradling him and like tossing him around, and he's being kind of a dick. And so I was like, okay, I'll take care of it. And so I went over there and rolled with him, and I quickly took his back. And I remember after I took his back, he kind of gloated. He was like, yeah, you're not going to be able to choke me. Everybody takes my back, but people can't choke me. My traps are too big. My neck's too big. You're not going to get it. And I just remember the arrogance of saying that really ran through me, because, you know, the guy was being mean to the smaller people, and he just wasn't being a good training partner, and the arrogance to think like you shouldn't have to learn how to defend back or whatever. So I was like, in my head at that point, I was like, I'm going to choke this dude. And I remember what happened was I was trying to go for the choke with my dominant arm. Like you said, I was playing on my dominant arm was my right hand. My dominant arm was my right arm. I was laying on my right side, and I was trying to choke him, and he just had such a good grip on it. So I just pulled the arm out. And as I did, I naturally came up to my elbow. And then from there, that's where I started playing this double arm over top. I grabbed his chin, pulled it up, and then slid right up underneath of his neck and choked him, and ended up choking about 6 more times in that round. And, had figured out this new weapon in my game just from sheer, I'm going to make it work. And I think a lot of people, that's where a lot of times we actually figure out things in our game. There are times where you might be faced with a particular body type, a particular style, or a particular training partner, whatever it might be. And they present a problem, and you can shy away from that problem and choose not to roll with them or whatever it is that you decide to do. Or you can sort of double down and say, I'm going to figure this out. And a lot of times you have really cool breakthroughs and you figure things out when you have that mindset where you say, okay, I'm going to figure this out. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to figure it out.
Yeah, most of the stuff that I do that people would generally call unique comes from experiments against people who are much bigger than me. I went through a whole phase where, as a smaller guy, I decided to basically see if I could solve the problem of just fighting up weight classes against equivalently experienced big dudes. And I made a whole bunch of discoveries about how my type of jiu-jitsu should work based on my body type and based on the type of people I'm sparring with. And you don't get those experiences if you shy away from those encounters. Correct. And I know it's easy to do that because, especially at a beginner level, nobody wants to go and have some big behemoth just squish them for 10 minutes straight. I know it's not fun, but if you get comfortable doing that, it actually learns to become oddly fun in a weird way. And it's a learning opportunity, right? And it's good to kind of retrain your brain to think that way so that rather than seeing such a thing as an unpleasant experience, you think of it as, hey, this is actually a great opportunity for me to solve a problem. I'm being presented with a really difficult, meaningful problem to solve. And the best way that I'm going to learn to solve it is by just getting in there and practicing and looking for solutions. So yeah, I agree with you 100% about that.
Yeah, and a lot of people want the skill, like you're talking about small guys to big guys. A lot of people want the skill, that they want that ability to be able to beat the big guys if they're smaller. But if you're going to do that, you actually have to roll with them. There's no there's no amount of like watching YouTube videos, finding some new fancy technique that's going to do that. What's going to do that is you actually rolling with those big guys, getting accustomed to their pressure, getting accustomed to their body, learning that you can survive, learning how to deal with that sort of stuff, which is going to happen through, again, it's not necessarily a head thinking thing. It's more of a body thing. And then after a while, you start to become so used to it that then you realize they're not submitting you anymore. And then you start finding all these opportunities. And smaller guys that have the ability to do that have the ability to sort of eat that and weather that storm early on with the big guys, those tend to be the most frustrating little guys to deal with because they end up learning how to become so frustrating, like for a big guy, because you can't pin them down. They know how to deal with your strength. They know how to find and weasel their way out to your back, and all of a sudden you're getting choked. And a lot of big guys hate dealing with smaller people because it wears them out. And if you learn how to utilize your speed, your movement, and everything else, it can be a blessing.
Yeah, I went through this phase myself where, like I said, I kind of took a sabbatical and I focused almost exclusively on training with big, experienced brown and black belts. So that was kind of my entire training regiment. And I was able over a period of a few years to build up a game that worked really well against them. And then I started training more again with the small, nimble people. And at this point in time, I find them so much harder to deal with than the big guys because I'm used to training with the big guys, but I don't have that level of experience with really, really wily small people with really good hip movement, really good guard retention, guard attacks. So at this point in time, I'm much more, I'm in much more danger of sparring with those guys. I mean, there are some people in my gym who are much, much smaller than me, but they're just so good and so active off of the bottom that they give me more trouble than a lot of the giants that we normally spar with. So it's one of those fun things where your results are kind of dictated by your training environment. And so if there's a problem you want to solve, you got to kind of move towards it rather than running away from it.
I mean, I think this is always the case, right? When you're faced with a problem, and maybe that's some deeper philosophy for you, right? So when you're faced with a problem, you need to do that thing. You need to go face it down rather than running away, because running away doesn't ever solve it, and it's not going to conquer the problem. It's just going to continue to grow. Now, I know some people will say injuries and things like that, and that can be a realistic worry. I would just say that if you have a big guy in your gym that you can train with, try to find good ones. Try to find the good guys, because there's plenty of big guys in the gym that usually, unless maybe you train in a a certain type of gym, usually you can find some big guys that aren't going to simply like pile drive you into the mat. and they'll engage with you. And then over time, you'll probably learn how to deal with the bigger guys. And then you won't have as many worries about injuries.
Yeah.
It's even like a lot of people will become, they will say white belts are so dangerous. They're dangerous. They're going to get me injured or whatever. And they can. But if you understand how to grapple with a new white belt or someone that's very untrained, then it's not such a bad thing. You have to grapple with them almost like you have to go back to like old school fighting jiu-jitsu where you have to keep them tight. You have to make sure that you almost have to imagine that there's punches, because when they flail around and elbows fly and you get hit with one, I mean, it's essentially a punch, right? So you have to basically limit the amount of movement that they can have in order to make sure that they don't hurt themselves or hurt you.
Yeah. And you also have to grind them out too, right? You have to not assume you're necessarily going to be able to be in and out of there in 30 seconds. You need to assume against a big, strong person that this might be a marathon instead of a sprint. And so you have to have patience, composure. You have to manage your energy. It's a very different strategy than someone your own size.
Sure. I mean, I've grappled with several. There was one competition I remember back. I was a brown belt. These guys were. I came to the competition. I weighed in with a hoodie and I had a backpack on. I didn't really care what I weighed in at. I was just like, throw me on the scale, and I ended up weighing in at 213 with all that on. The weight class cutoff, I think, was 211. So I probably could have went down to the lower weight class. Well, it was 213 and up. So basically I was in the heaviest division. So on the brown belt day, it really didn't matter because they found some brown belts that were close to weight and we competed. It was no big deal. But the second day, the no-gi day, I remember I was by far the smallest person in the division. The person that I went against the first round was 300 pounds. The next person was 245. The next guy was 275. I mean, these guys were just huge. And every one of them could wrestle. So it was fantastic, right? So like I wasn't getting a takedown on any of them. And I remember basically every match essentially had the same pattern. I pulled guard and then had to sort of weather the storm because I didn't have enough power or energy or whatever it is to just simply blast them and get them out of balance. And then towards the end of the match, then I would start to take over. And this happened over and over again. The only exception to this was in the finals. I managed to get a sweep really quickly from half guard. And then immediately the guy, he bench pressed me off and then got on top of me. And then it followed the rhythmic pattern that had been established, which was then he started pressuring into me. I had to weather the storm and then that. So you're absolutely right about that. You have to, when you're up against women that's big and strong, you have to get ready and assume that they're going to be really strong. It's going to feel really strong. It's going to be very difficult to deal with. Be okay with that. And then you've got to be ready to play that long game. And, if you're rolling for, let's say 10 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever it is, whatever the length is, think about the fact that you're probably going to focus on conserving some energy, being safe the whole time. And then towards the other half of that is when you're really going to try to make your mark.
Yeah. Makes tons of sense. Hey, I got a question for you while we're talking about back mount here. What are your thoughts on some of the variants of back mount, like the body triangle, for example? Do you ever play any of those, or do you always find that you gravitate towards a more traditional back mount?
I can't really play a body triangle against anyone that's probably not like 6 years old.
Same.
My legs aren't terribly long and my thighs are decently muscled, so I don't have a lot of space in there to play. So I don't play body triangles very often. I teach them, I'll teach them to people so they can use them. I tend to play most often if I'm playing the underarm side, then I'm playing a very just slightly off angle and I've got my normal, my bottom hook's coming up to the hip, top leg is over top of that hook and I'm playing that. If I'm playing the strong side or the overarm side on the bottom, I'm typically playing halfback because it stops. Because typically if you've got your traditional dominant arm on the bottom with the choking arm and then you've got your seatbelt there, for instance, it's very easy for the person. They can't fight head position like they would for the other side. So instead what a lot of times they'll get is they'll start fighting your hips. And once their hips can get flat, then their whole body just starts getting flat. So to fight the hips and keep their hips locked in place, I'll play a halfback where I take one hook out and I cross it right behind extend their leg out right behind. And that helps me fight the hips there. And so I tend to play that. So a lot of times, for instance, in competition, I will get my hooks, get the 2 points or whatever, if there's a points, and then I'll take the one hook or the top hook off and then play it behind their knee or just cross my feet. So it stops them from being able to move their hips. And so I like the variations and I tend to show the variations. I honestly think that back mount should not be like when you go to a competition, a lot of times they use the hooks and the seatbelt as kind of the definitive you've got back mount. I don't think that's not the only criteria that should be judged for back mount. I think body triangles, half back, seatbelts, and all that stuff, all the grips are fine because again, that's not really what's important. What's important is that they have some control and they're able to maintain the chest to back connection without the person on their knees where they could get up and run away. They're on their side typically, and you've got chest to back connection and you establish that for more than 3 seconds. The legs position, the arms positions can be so different. So I don't think it needs to be the seatbelt grip, for instance, or not the seatbelt grip, but the hooks, excuse me.
I'm totally on board with you there. I think that the way that we score back mount is a bit pedantic. You know, you're only really allowing points for one variation of back mount when there's a whole bunch of other variants that are equally effective. So what winds up happening is people adjust their jiu-jitsu to game the system. So they're doing things that aren't even necessarily optimally effective for them, but they're basically stopping through the traditional position, not because they want to, but because they need to get the points.
Right.
I mean, my feeling is, like you said, if you can glue your chest to your opponent's back for a significant period of time, I think you should call that back mount regardless of how it's done. I mean, you've achieved the objective. You've put the person in an extraordinarily disadvantageous fighting position. So I don't see any reason why, you know, half back, body triangle, even like a kneeling, like Tellus Panda type thing. If you can hold the person there, as long as you can glue your chest to their back for 3 seconds, I think that should be 4 points. But that's just me.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate this a lot. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about on the topic of back control before we tie this one up, Nick, or did we cover everything?
No, I mean, gosh, we didn't certainly cover everything. I mean, we could keep going for a long time, I'm sure.
We could be here for 5 hours.
Yeah, we could go for a long time, but I think there's plenty of useful information for people to kind of just chew on and sort of think about.
Well, if people want to dig deeper into your work, I know you mentioned you guys have been working on back mount. Where's the best place for people to find you?
I mean, if you guys don't know who I am or haven't really heard of me, which is definitely possible, right? I don't mean that in any sort of like arrogant way. Then you can probably, the best place to get started would be to head on to YouTube, youtube.com, and you can put in just Chewjitsu, CHEWJITSU. You'll find me. You know, you'll find my stuff. That's where I have the biggest chunk of my information as far as the stuff that I put out publicly. I have a playlist with my back mount technique. So any of the stuff that I've talked about, chunks of that information will be there. So if you want to check it out, you can go to YouTube, look up my YouTube channel, and then there's going to be a playlist for back mount. You can check it out.
Awesome. And I'll try to put that stuff in the show notes as well. Any other premium stuff or instructionals you want to plug while I've got you here?
Yeah, I mean, I have instructionals and I have a website. You know, if someone's interested in that kind of stuff, go to my website at chujitsu.net. And I have an email newsletter that I send out. I send out a daily message, a daily email regarding all sorts of different stuff. It could be something very technical related all the way to some sort of philosophical rambling. And with that, you'll get a couple free ebooks. And then on top of that, I will give you details over different periods of time about different instructionals that I have going on. But again, if you're just wanting to sort of see what I have to offer in the beginning, go to YouTube first. And then if you want to go a little deeper, go to my website at chujitsu.net. You can sign up for my newsletter.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Nick. And of course, if anyone wants to check out our stuff, I mean, presumably you know where to find us because you found us already. But if not, BJJMentalModels.com is the best place to do that. That links off to all of the podcast episodes we've ever done. It links off to an easy form to shoot me a message. And of course, we've got our whole database of concepts we've got listed there if you need a reference guide. We also offer a pretty sweet premium series, premium.bjjmentalmodels.com. That's the best way to support us, in addition to being the best way to kind of get full maximal benefit from the programs that we offer. There's a ton of premium audio stuff on there, as well as direct coaching from myself and other black belts in the community. So please do check that out. It makes a big difference to me personally. Premium.bjjmentalmodels.com. There's a free trial, so no harm in giving it a shot. Chewy, thanks again for coming by. Really appreciate this. And I love your work. It's awesome to finally get a chance to talk to you because your stuff has been such a staple of the jiu-jitsu community for so long. So big thanks to you for everything you do. And thanks again for coming by and dropping some wisdom on us.
Absolutely, bro. Thank you for having me on.
No worries. And of course, to everyone out there who listens, thanks again to you as well. And we'll talk to you next week.